Hello everyone, Flandre here, and today we are going to take a look at the second batch of HD-18s that recently came into the country. As many of you all may know, there was a first batch that came in over a year ago. There was a lot of controversy, a lot of drama around them, and honestly a lot of us didn't think there were going to be any more coming in, but just now there's a second batch that came in, so we can now compare these second batch rifles to the original first batch rifles that came in. And if there are any other changes, we can compare them to the original Russian SVD and the Russian SVD parts. We're not going to go too in depth probably on the Russian SVD comparisons, as I previously did a video on the first version of this rifle from the first batch and compared it to the Russian SVD and all the Russian SVD parts, as well as like Soviet era parts, modern parts. And I did an entire history of all the rifle changes that happened from the original Soviet era rifles all the way up to the modern ones, and how the HD-18 kind of fit into that whole scheme. If you want to have more details on that, you should watch that first video. This video, we're mostly going to be comparing this second generation rifle to the first generation rifle, and if there's anything that they changed, and if there's anything we need to compare to the Russian rifle parts, we will do a comparison to that if necessary. So I just got this rifle in, and let's go ahead and open it up. So as you can see right here, it's still all in wrap, so we're going to have to undo it. As the previous ones came, these ones look like they do have the magazines, the extras, including the muzzle brake there. They come with the paperwork, cleaning rod, and a scope. These scopes here are marked FEG, but I can tell you right now, these are definitely not FEG made. They are definitely Zenit Belmo scopes. And now we can go ahead and take the rifle out of the wrap here. So first things first, we know for a fact that the furniture here is in fact exactly the same. I do not see anything different on this furniture compared to the original HD-18 furniture that came in on the first batch of rifles. However, I do see some differences between this new version and the previous gen, and I'll talk about that in a second. The most notable thing I notice here is we have an SVD-S style safety selector, which is definitely different from the SVD safety selector, so it's odd that that's there, but we'll talk more about that in a moment. So why don't we get this case out of the way and go a little bit more in depth on the parts. Looks like we have a snap cap in there, which is new. The first versions did not have this. The selector lever looks like it has already been moved down. It already has scratch on the receiver. It should be noted that the first time we had to take these handguards off on the first generation rifles, it was extremely difficult, so we'll see if that's different. So far, that was way easier. I already see a difference here. So they definitely improved these handguards. The original Russian ones also have these metal reinforced tabs on the Soviet era wooden handguards, and it looks like they've gone ahead and copied that on these. That makes it much easier to take in and out. The original first generation HD-18 handguards did not have these, it was just wood, and they expanded and they're extremely difficult to remove. However, I still do not like these handguards. I do not like the style of these handguards, so they will be swapped out for Russian ones. It should be noted, because this is a new generation style rifle, the correct style handguards are polymer and not wood. Even though I have wood on mine, I like to dress it up sometimes, but it is incorrect, especially with that Type 3 dust cover and slab side receiver. The op rod was for some reason much more difficult to remove than on a regular SVD, and it's definitely harder than my other HD-18, which is strange. Gas piston looks as if it has been shot from the factory. You can definitely see some carbon on it, so it looks like they did test fire it. I'm not going to bother taking off the gas regulator, but I see it is pretty much the same as the other ones where it has the painted on markings here. I'll talk a bit more in the finish in a moment because there is a difference here. Okay, so with the other two rifles disassembled, we can go ahead and do some comparisons now. So the main thing that I noticed here is that there actually isn't a lot of difference between this first generation rifle here and the second generation rifle here. The muzzle brakes / front sight block of the HD-18 is still this crappy sporterized contraption that they decided to come up with. Not entirely sure what they were thinking in regards to that design, but it is the same from the previous generation. The rivet looks a little bigger on the rivet that holds the detent in place that prevents the threads from being exposed. But other than that, there isn't really a whole much difference there. The stock and furniture is the same. Like I said before, I did replace the furniture on my first generation rifle. And of course, I also put the Soviet front sight block on this one as well. The dust covers here are just about identical. They're both Type 3 style dust covers. Of course, you'll notice the finish and color is slightly different, and I'll talk about that in a second. Receivers are just about the same. I took calipers off camera to them. I didn't really notice anything different between the receivers and the barrels. The finish is slightly darker on this bolt carrier, although I have seen Russian ones with slightly darker color on the bolt carriers as well. It's still exactly the same modern Russian style bolt carrier here. Like I said previously, it's pretty much everything on this is like a modern SVD spec parts. I do notice here on the bolt, however, that there is a full serial number on the bolt, which is strange. The originals would have had just 3 digits. Now the Russian ones also have 5 digits, although it can vary based on era and time and type of rifle, but they typically will have a few serials stamped. This one does have an engraved serial. That's the entire serial number on the bolt. So we can go ahead and talk about markings a bit here. If we look at the first generation HD-18, we have the 02 prefix that's slightly offset to the serial number here. We see on the barrel here where it also has the serial number without the 02 prefix. And we do have some proof marks and some stampings on the barrel. Also on the receiver, we do have some engraved marks here. We have the half moon stamp over another marking. And the importer marks on this one are painted on the side of the receiver. As we see here, there are 4 lines. On the new generation rifle, however, we have a new style serial number. This is a new production rifle. It does have a new serial. You can see the 02 prefix right there. And on the barrel here, we have the serial number engraved on the side right here with the 02 prefix. We see some grind marks. We see new importer markings on the barrel, which is new, as these are engraved on the barrel. And we have importer marks painted on the receiver. That should be noted on the first generation rifle. There are no importer marks except for the ones painted. This one has painted and engraved. We have on the front here of the markings HKI, Tampa, Florida, and that is because B&T HKI was acquired by Trident, so they are now an entity under them. We do have the model HD-18 and caliber and FEG Arms Corporation. On the receiver, we have painted on HD-18 sporting rifle, FEG Arms and Machine Comp, made in Hungary, Budapest, 762, Trident Arms. So we have an extra line there, and they added Budapest to Hungary. So that is new. The font is slightly different size, and it is a slightly different font as well. Okay, so the next thing we're going to look at in terms of markings is the fire control groups here. As we can see here, they've now put the markings onto the side of the trigger group housings here, instead on the bottom. Originally they were stamped on the bottom, and now instead they are painted on. If we look at a Tigr fire control group here, you can also see it was stamped on the bottom, It should be noted that the Soviet ones were stamped on the side, usually around here. But that goes to our next differences between these rifles, and that is the sear hole on the actual fire control group. So originally, on the first generation of HD-18 fire control groups, they had welded over the sear hole where the safety sear would have been. The new generations don't appear to be welded until you look closely. And it may be a little hard to see, but if you look in there, you can kind of see where there's weld on the inside of that fire control group housing here. They've just done a better job at kind of hiding the weld by machining and grinding, and then they painted the serial number over where their hole would be. On the originals, it was a little bit more obvious. It should be noted that there really isn't any reason to weld over or even remove the sear. The original KBIs, KBI SVD imports, did have the safety sear installed. All of those imports were legal. They were approved with the safety sear. There's no issue with them. Same with the Soviet era SVDs. They also have safety sears on them, as these were never fully automatic. They were always semi-automatic guns, and the safety sear was never really an issue. In fact, the receivers, including the HD-18 receivers, do in fact have a cutout on the inside of the receiver there that clears a safety sear. So if I do take a Soviet or KBI trigger pack here and insert it into the HD-18, including this new one, it does clear the safety sear cut inside of the receiver. There's nothing illegal about that. These were semi-automatic only rifles, so that should be noted. There is a misconception about these. The next thing I'm going to look at here is actually the selector lever here, because the selector lever is different. As I mentioned when I first opened this rifle, this is an SVDS selector lever. If we look at the previous HD-18, we see the tab here is bottom mounted, whereas on the new one, it is now top mounted. And if we take a look at an SVDS here from a kit, you'll notice that this is a top mounted tab here. The reason for that is so that when the stock folds, it clears the folded stock in the folded position. That is why they have a top mounted tab on the SVDS. If we look at the HD-18, the new HD-18, and the SVDS selector, other than finish, which we'll talk about in a moment, we notice that there's almost no differences between them. In fact, the embossing on the rear here is identical as well. If we compare that to the old HD-18 lever, we see this is an SVD style. The embossing is different on the rear, and there's slight differences between the two. You'll notice there are differences between the SVDS style and the SVD style. If I grab my Tigr lever, we'll see the Tigr lever and the first generation HD-18 are the same. The embossing is the same on these as well, whereas embossing is different compared to these SVDS style levers. So for whatever reason, my particular second generation HD-18 came with an SVDS lever. That could just be my rifle. David did send me a photo of when these rifles first came in, and the sample he showed me also had an SVDS style lever. I did notice that in the photo he sent me. So that comes to the very last difference between these rifles, and that is the finish. These are no longer painted. These new generation rifles are in fact like blued. Looks like they put them into a hot blue tub and painted them that way. They were definitely sandblasted and then blued, whereas the originals here are painted. You can see the difference in the finish there. You can also notice a difference on the rear sights here, where the newer ones look a little brighter. The paint looks a little brighter on the rear sight leaf. They appear to have left the actual gas regulators painted, but other than that, everything else is now blued. They changed the finish process. The original HD-18 had a black satin style finish that was pretty much identical to the modern Russian satin style black finish, just like the Tigr, any of the new modern Russian SVDs on the civilian market and on the Russian military market. Other than that, I don't see any notable changes between the two generations of HD-18 rifles. The main differences now are just these are blued instead of painted. They have markings that are slightly different. They have the new engraved serial numbers. They have the new importer marks and the new engraved importer marks. And at least on mine, and at least another one that I've seen, they have the SVD S style selector levers. There is no other notable changes between the two generations of rifles. And as I mentioned previously, we already know all the differences between this particular rifle and the Russian spec rifles. And if you want to have more information on that, you should watch my first video on these particular rifles. I should also note that on the inside of the receiver, they did change the screws out on the inside here. The bolt here is a lopped off M6. You can clearly see how they lopped off the end of an M6 screw right here. And now it looks like complete dog shit. It's too long. And you can see this other hardware style screw that they put in for the stock here. It's strange they did that, but that is the case. So I can't think of anything else to talk about these rifles. It pretty much is what it is in terms of the comparison between the new generation and the old generation. I hope you all found this informative. So as always, have a good one.
Патрон в патроннике, ежели что. Головы рубили, зарабатывал вес. Тут каждый, кто пил, допивая, нашел личную выгоду и свой интерес. Накал пламенел, озарял города. Неминуемая ямалыбу давила ехидна. Тут человек пропадал навсегда. В самом себе себя же не было видно. В этом омуте карикатур, слова, шо вода. В голову залез топор, троглодиты налетай. Сохрани ты беспризорник, это пламя на века. Тут ракеты поджигали, ожидая благодать. Тесная лирика слов обнаружила меня, ты снова без ответа. Ноги потеряли любовь, ноги не вели туда, где была мечта заветная. Где была мечта заветная? 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 Тут патрон в патроннике, ежели что. Головы рубили, зарабатывал вес. Тут каждый, кто пил, допивая, нашел личную выгоду и свой интерес. Накал пламенел, озарял города. Неминуемая ямалыбу давила ехидна. Тут человек пропадал навсегда. В самом себе себя же не было видно.
Районы испорчены, мы же измотаны. Помоги, боссы и кожаные без любви летают над городом фонари. Так угасала дикая страсть. Об этом не стоит просить и писать, но я беру силы извне, черпаю, что есть. Большая история началась здесь и сейчас. Руины полезут из недр, тянутся выше до неба. Играет моя фонотека, она сохранит человека. Верю в удачный исход поединка. Если не сейчас, знаю, впереди так. Голову забили злые языки. I need some sleep.
Тут патрон в патроннике, ежели что. Головы рубили, зарабатывал вес. Тут каждый, кто пил, допивая, нашел личную выгоду и свой интерес. Накал пламенел, озарял города. Неминуемая ямалыбу давила ехидна. Тут человек пропадал навсегда. В самом себе себя же не было видно. Тут патрон в патроннике, ежели что. Головы рубили, зарабатывал вес. Тут каждый, кто пил, допивая, нашел личную выгоду и свой интерес. Накал пламенел.